All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. Got chapter 27, section 3, Socialism and Labor Movements. So, socialism is a movement. It can mean a couple of different things, but it's really a movement to, I don't know, in a sense, we might say the ultimate goal is to abolish private property. The idea that people should own things individually. Instead, what socialism seeks to do is to kind of gear more towards either government ownership or communal ownership. And so this was the movement to challenge, really those who, at least in this particular period, own what sometimes Karl Marx refers to as the quote-unquote means of production. And in this era, we're talking specifically about factories, right? So kind of the big, you might say, gripe that the socialists have, or that the movement of socialism has, is that, these factories are owned by individuals who make a lot of money off the exploitation of their workers. Meanwhile, labor movements were groups or organizations of workers. And their main goal was not necessarily to challenge this notion of private property, but they were just looking to improve their condition, you might say, working conditions, living conditions. They just want things to get better in the factories. Now, there were others who had more extreme views. We'll call these revolutionary alternatives. That is to fundamentally challenge industrial society, the type of society that was created by the Industrial Revolution. The most well-known of these is Karl Marx, who, of course, created the theory of communism, sometimes also referred to as Marxism. And Marx, in some sense, was a socialist, but he also predicted, or he outlined sort of his ideology by saying in industrial society there were pretty much two classes. There were the wealthy and the exploited, and pretty much this is something based off of class. We might say something based off of wealth. In Marx's view, there were two types of people in society, and that was it. Either you own the factory, right? So the owners, that might also include things like investors, and then the workers, right? And as society becomes more and more industrial, the gap between the owners and the workers grows ever bigger, right? And that over time, the workers become more and more exploited. And according to Marx, this would lead to a revolution in which the workers, right, the working class, would overthrow the owners, would seize the means of production, so the owners would be gone, and would establish what would be known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. So this was Marx's, we might say Marx's workers' revolution, right? And that was the idea, that the workers would rise up after being exploited by the factory owners, would establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletariat is another term that just means worker. Would redistribute the material wealth, would take private property and abolish it, and create a system that would end poverty and end injustice. We might also call this a utopia, right? And that was the idea of kind of creating a classless world, a world in which everybody is equal, and the divisions which existed before between the owners and the workers would forever be gotten rid of. And of course, these ideas that were espoused by Marx, he was German, he was writing around the time of the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s in places like Germany and England. These ideas became very powerful and very influential around the world, right? Communism, we'll talk a lot more about it. That's probably the more popular term associated with it. Eventually has its reach pretty much not just in industrial societies, but all around the world. Some, and the degree to which people agreed with Marx varied. So, for example, some said that, yes, industrial society is, in fact, exploitive, but didn't 100% agree with Karl Marx. Anarchists, for example, generally speaking, we say that anarchism maybe advocates for what we might call the eradication of government. And really what the anarchists kind of disagreed with Marx on was this idea here. Anarchists believed that once the workers were in power, that they would be no different than the owners, and that you couldn't rely upon a dictator of the proletariat or dictatorship of the proletariat to sort of do all these things. And so rather, you have to kind of get rid of the arm of state power completely in order to eradicate this. And, communists, Marxists, anarchists, there were various degrees of them. So, for example, some of them were involved in, political parties that wanted to do things through a non-violent way. At the other extreme, there was assassinations, which was especially true in the case of anarchists. Anarchists used assassination as a tool in order to create political change. Elizabeth of Austria, King Umberto of Italy, and President William McKinley were all assassinated by anarchists in an effort to try to bring about sort of revolutionary change. And the various disagreements within this, what we might call revolutionary ideology, whether it's Marxism or communism or anarchism, again, there are various degrees of how these things play out. Marx was somebody who pretty much said, wait for things to get to this sort of, exploited kind of situation here. Other people said, no, action is needed, violence is needed. So the tactics really differ. But the one thing that remains the same between, these more radical beliefs is this challenge to industrial society, fundamentally this difference between class and wealth, trying to reconcile that. Meanwhile, though, most people were more likely to be associated with something, more people would have been associated with something like a labor union or a labor movement. And again, these individuals or these organizations were much less likely to look to, again, abolish private property and overthrow governments and assassinate, heads of states. Instead, they were more focused on things like improving wages, getting insurance, getting old age pensions. They used tactics like going on strike, endorsing politicians, right, in countries that had democracies. So a little bit less radical means. One thing that pretty much all labor unions advocated for was universal male suffrage, which was achieved in the US in 1870, France and Germany in 1871, Britain in 1885. And this was, of course, a way to use politics to improve working conditions, right? Especially for those who were of the working poor. Once they could vote people in office or exercise political power, they could see real change when it came to legislation regarding the workplace. And one thing also to note is that for the most part, labor unions and movements were mostly dominated by men. For working class women, other voices were clear on this matter. Rosa Luxemburg and Emma Goldman. These were we might call radical. Emma Goldman was an anarchist. Luxemburg was more of a socialist / communist. And, they wrote and talked about the way that institutions like labor unions really neglected women, and that instead, their radical ideology was more towards, we might say, instead of liberation of the working class, we might say, the liberation of women from men. At the time, people like Luxemburg and Goldman didn't have very big audiences, but since then, a lot of their publications and their works have been kind of revisited and reused by successive generations.